All right, so welcome to everybody who has dialed in to this webinar on tariffs and to a lesser degree, I guess, geopolitical uncertainty, helping the biopharmaceutical industry work together to minimize impact on global supply chains. It's it was scheduled after our second event to do this when we felt that we would know more about tariffs and the tariff situation. We are still in somewhat of a quandary, a little bit of a hiatus, I guess, with extensions on actual impacts and actual tariff amounts. But I guess we can at least maybe think about that before it happens to us, and maybe have a consideration for how we want to go about mitigating against tariff risk in terms of impact on operations, and for yourselves as well. Obviously, commercial aspects too may mean that it has an impact on operations, and that's what we're focused on in BioPhorum, is on the impact on operations and operational excellence. So just whilst people are joining us, to make you aware, this is obviously a professional environment. We do operate within a legal framework and a policy framework. We are trusting of you to be in that mindset when you join with us and participate in our events. So I'm not going to over labor the point, but please do remember that when you're engaging in conversation or discussion. Hopefully you will be later in this session. The agenda for today's hour is a quick blast through the introductions and the meeting operation, setting the context. Then I'm going to hand over as the Forum Director for Supply Resilience. I'm very pleased to bring Roy Santana from the World Trade Organization to give a presentation on aspects of the World Trade Organization from his perspective. And Roy will introduce himself in more detail when it comes to that. Then what I'm hoping is that we can have, as a group, an open Q&A, if you like, or a discussion session where people can anonymously put questions in, or can be overt about it and put the questions in via the chat function, and ask fellow industry people maybe for answers or considerations or thoughts on where we are in terms of managing through and mitigating the tariff scenario that we're in at the moment. And that should bring us to an hour, hopefully. If we need to finish before the hour, then that's not a problem either. And we'll play it by ear and see what the level of engagement is. So as I said, if you do want to raise a question, then please use the raise a hand function, which is up on the top of your bar. It should be there. You can write into the chat box as well. I think we've got a Q&A area that you can put a question into. So if you want to ask us a question. And we have an MS form that we sent round prior to the meeting. You can write in there anonymously a question, and we will read it out on your behalf if you like. It's a bit like an Ask BioPhorum, which is a service we provide across our forum spaces, and it'll be a bit of a live one, and then you can ask the people on the call, your fellow peers from the industry, and they might be able to give you some insight and answer. We do have a small number of polls just to find out a bit of information about who's on the call and to ask some questions of you from our perspective as BioPhorum. We do ask that you share your ideas, your thoughts, your experiences, and any considered views that you might have. We are recording. So we're recording now, and we're recording all the way through. So again, when you come all off microphone or off camera and come onto camera and onto microphone, please do remember that when you're speaking and when we put it into the open session. Cool. So we're going to ask you a quick poll question. I'm going to ask Steve in a moment just to launch that poll for us, so that what we want to know is what's the split roughly between supplier companies, people providing raw materials and consumables or services into the biopharmaceutical manufacturing industry, or those people that are working for a biomanufacturer company in either CDMO or in a license holding capacity, or if indeed we've got some other people on this webinar call that might have interests in being here. So please, can we launch that poll, Steve? So there you go. You should see a window appear in your screen that you can then answer the question, and then you can submit, and we get a viewpoint in. So I'm just going to share where we are with that at the moment on the screen there. So you can see we've had a good number of responses. It's about a 50-50 split between suppliers and biomanufacturers, with a few others thrown in for good measure. I'm sure that some of the BioPhorum people on the call have answered that one, and maybe Roy himself. We've got more people replying. We've got 50 on the call at the moment, so we've not got quite everybody. So if you want to have a response to that, please do put your answer in. Oh, there you go. A few more suppliers coming in. So we're a good mix. All right. Carry on answering that. The poll should be available for you to have a look at, and if not, we'll probably put it in the event report overall. So it'd be good to know what the final result is. So thank you for that. A nice level of engagement. Let me move this screen out of the way. Great. So as I said, we had over 100 people register for this, so there's obviously still quite a lot of interest in this area. And when I've looked at a lot of surveys that are done by other organisations, certainly at the C-suite level, tariffs are a standout topic of highest level of interest still, probably because of the high level of uncertainty and the fact that we don't actually have answers yet, that although we might have some indication of what's happening, and it might also trickle over into sort of midterm and longer term planning, strategic planning for organizations. So as you've seen, we're with biomanufacturers and suppliers in attendance on this call, which is great. So we're the people that are affected, both on the outbound supply chain of finished drug products going to countries where the patients will ultimately take those drug products, and also from a supplier's perspective supporting that to happen, but also on the inbound supply chain side of things, where raw materials and consumables are being shipped across globally distributed supply chains into manufacturing facilities to support the manufacture of those bulk drug substances. So obviously where we are has generated a high level of interest in this area and in this meeting. I've already mentioned earlier that we're going to have some poll-based questions, which might help stimulate some discussion, not too many. But we do appreciate the fact that you've been quite a good audience so far, and many of you answering the polls, which is great. And I said, if you want to ask a question, the chat function is available to you. You can raise a hand, and then at an appropriate moment in time, if you leave your hand raised up, one of my team will spot you, and then at a break, allow that question to be asked if you want to ask it yourself. Or if you want to do it anonymously, there is a link which will be cut into the chat for you to access, that Ali, my colleague, has put in there for you. Hopefully you can use that link, and it should open an MS form, and you should then be able to write in whatever your question is. It won't record who's done that, and then we can look at that and follow it and check and ask that question for you. We appreciate there's a degree of sensitivity around this topic area because it's quite close to commercial aspects, it's quite close to strategy from a business organizational point of view, but there's still a lot of space and room and commonality for us all want to be able to share where we are with thoughts and ideas and what we might be doing. And we do hope that you get a good bit of insight from it, from the conversation later in this session. Context. So if you've attended one of these calls before by being a member of BioPhorum, and we've had sort of two of them, one in December and one in May, then some of this stuff will be familiar to you. It should be familiar to you as people that have got an interest in tariffs and what's going on in the external environment. We still don't know what's happening with the Biosecure Act. It's kind of been put on pause, but it's still out there as a threat, and it still was quite strongly supported when it was initially muted. It may reappear at the end of the year, who knows. We've seen a lot of activity on tariffs in general, and the US and China at this moment in time this week have been in negotiations in Sweden on that, and they've paused again and pushed out what the activities will be. I think we're at a 30% tariff following the climb down from the initial rate for importation of goods from China generally into the US, and I think it's 10% if you're importing into China goods from the US. So it's not as scary as we first were led to believe, with triple digit percentages being talked about back in the day. We know that people are shipping more volume of goods into different markets to try and avoid being hit by elevated tariffs. So if you're a manufacturer based in Ireland, you may have already been manufacturing higher volumes in the first half of 2025 and shipping those out to the USA. They've recorded imports from, or the Ireland has shared information on export data to the US, where it's up in the 150%, 200% sometime for some of finished drug products being shipped over to the USA. So there's obviously some inventory building going on. What that means for the second half of 2025 and whether that will continue or not is still an outstanding question, I guess, that needs to be discussed, and whether we're sort of doing it all early and then it's going to be very thin for the back end of 2025 going into 2026. That's a concern, I guess. Something similar to what happened with COVID, where there was a big inventory build and then some really low-level demand signals coming back after that, as you might expect, and therefore not a lot of activity going on in the supply chain. So that's a challenge for us as an industry if we want to be balanced about things. The pharmaceutical tariffs, the 90-day grace period ended. It was then extended. I think it's been extended again to the 12th of August. So this slide's slightly out of date from the recent meetings. There are tariffs set under the World Trade Pharma Agreement that we're going to hear about from Roy, and they are for certain pharmaceutical products and intermediates and some materials in manufacturing. But the detail is in there, and that's the challenge for us. There's an anticipated 15% tariff on pharmaceuticals between the EU and the US under the current negotiations between the EU and the US. Where that sits with the World Trade Organization Pharma Trade Agreement and the fact that there are zero tariffs set there, we're not sure, and maybe that's a question. There's obviously an ongoing national security investigation about the impact of the importation of pharmaceuticals and pharmaceutical ingredients on the US, and whether there is a degree of threat to the national security there. That's not due to report out still till later in the year, so it's 270 days from the start is the time set that it should be done in. I believe they're trying to bring it in earlier than that, but I can't find any data that says where there's an end date yet. And then obviously we've had executive orders that have been signed, and this one potentially is even more impactful to us as an industry than tariffs, because this is about actually taking the American market to most favored nation pricing, which would be a significant price drop to bring it in line with other peer markets around the world for paying the same price for their prescription drugs and finished drug products as other nations, and that's where there's some debate about raising prices in Europe, for example, to soften that blow off a bit and bring the gap to be less. But if that is something that is going to be driven as a strategy by the US government going forward, then that is a concern for us as an industry overall, I guess, because it will drive a lot of operational changes as people decide where they're going to manufacture their products, as they will with tariffs, and how they're going to then find the supply chains to support that manufacturing. So that's a little bit of context for us where we are in that general. The geopolitical things that are obviously still cooking and going on. We've still got some conflict areas, which causes troubles for distributions, for lanes and channels, and also for servicing those countries themselves with finished drug products. We're coming into the summer period. I haven't yet seen any reports of wildfires in Los Angeles, but I'm sure they'll and California. I'm sure they'll be coming. I'm sure they'll be in other areas. We've even had them in the UK, believe it or not, in England. So it's and in other parts, I believe. So it's it's more and more sort of an event that happens. And obviously the Russia earthquake this week, one of the largest ones we've ever had at 8.8. Luckily for us and people in the Pacific Rim area, there was not a massive tsunami event that followed it. So it looks like we've perhaps dodged what could have been a pretty catastrophic situation there. but these things are becoming more and more, well, they are common. We had a Taiwanese earthquake not that long ago as well, of a significant size. So there's things happening in the world. Always things to add a little bit of extra spice for what we do in supply chain management. When we look at tariffs and we look at first order, second order, and third order things that are happening, some of these things I've kind of mentioned, but I think when we first saw tariffs, there was a little bit of disruption at movement of physical goods as border control were looking at processing things, and there was more volume of materials coming through, and then we had shortages of FDA staff, always a bit of a challenge. Second order things, we saw people starting to change manufacturing volumes, decide pulling back a bit maybe. People were looking at change notifications as they went looking for sources of supply of materials from different countries or regions. And then there was some immediate shift of manufacturing, maybe using CDMOs to do that, to maybe look at how to do that. The third order side of things, people have experienced maybe some audit delays from regulatory agencies if they were waiting on those. Change notification approval delays could happen if there's significant volume of them are coming through. Further volume readjustments. I've mentioned those other complications like the Russia earthquake, but one of the things that I've picked up, which is different to the way we presented this slide back in May, was the long-term plans to shift manufacturing operations, taking a more in-region, for-region focus. Then there's the whole concept of tech transfer for that manufacturing process from, say, Europe into the US to do that. And then you've got to establish a supply chain that can support that manufacturing process in the US. And then how are you going to find those suppliers and re-qualify your supply chain to be able to do that? So that's quite a challenge from an operations perspective and quite a lot of disruption. This is just a reference to the two events that we've been looking at this, as I said, since December, when the first issues were raised around the Biosecure Act, which thankfully disappeared a bit, but tariffs were mentioned back then. We had this meeting about tariffs inside the BioPhorum membership on the 15th of May to discuss it, and we had a huge amount of people dial into that, and over 200 registrants. And this is our third event in this, and we decided to make it an open event, so to bring in people from outside as well, because we felt that it was to the benefit of the whole of the industry if we did that approach rather than just keeping it inside BioPhorum, and hopefully that will be the case. We've been running a number of events. This has cropped up through our structure as BioPhorum at the highest level with the annual BioPhorum, which is a once-off event of senior sponsors within the industry. And our senior BioPhorum Connect have also looked at this and wanted to know about it from an end-to-end supply chain perspective. There's been specific discussions about the FDA shortages and about the impact of that. For us, it impacts on things like customs approval and things like that. So that's why we put it in here. It does have some impact on what goes on in supply chain movement of materials. We've had 3 of our work streams met to discuss supply chain process risk and quality management, and share what their thoughts were on it. And tariffs were a part of that discussion that happened fairly recently, last month. And our leadership team, we have a quarterly leadership team. The last one was a few weeks ago now, 3 weeks ago or so. We shared the fact that we are now moving as Supply Resilient, which is the forum that I'm responsible for as the forum director, into a supply chain holistic approach. Previously, we were only looking at the inbound supply chain side of things. Our supply chain to patient forum has now been brought into our supply resilience space with us, and we're looking at everything from inbound through the manufacturing supply chain, from bulk drug substance, moving materials to fill finish factories, and then moving finished drug product out into the countries where the patients will ultimately take those products. That was a very interesting meeting. It was over 3 days, and we focused a lot on the communication requirements and the data requirements to better inform us what's going on across the whole length of the end-to-end supply chain. And that was that's been used to then help direct what we're doing as a program of work. Cool. Where are we for time? Right. So we have a crisis response and management team. We're looking at sourcing strategies, and that'll start in September. And we've got a trade compliance work stream, which is ongoing at the moment and is going into some publication guidance. It will be creating some guidance that it will then publish. So that's just to give you an insight of what goes on inside BioPhorum and inside supply resilience. Right. Roy's been waiting a bit longer than he thought he was going to be, so I'm going to now pass over to Roy and let him introduce himself. And he's going to talk to us about the World Trade Organization's Pharma Agreement, and I hope you find this very interesting and insightful as an audience. So, and after that, we'll take some questions, so please do get ready to raise your hand or type into chat, and we can ask the questions, and you can get some answers, perhaps from your peers on this call, or from Roy, or from any of us that might be able to answer if you ask a question. Roy, over to you. You can come off mute and you can take the screen.
Thank you very much, Bob. As you were having your list of disasters and wars and everything, I was just thinking, oh my God, it's still half of the year to go, no?
Yes.
So let's see what else we have to deal with for the rest of the year. Just give me 1 second to put on my screen.
Yeah.
Perhaps just to tell you about myself. So myself is Roy Santana. I have been working for the World Trade Organization more or less for like 20 years. I am originally from Costa Rica. I have been working on tariff and this type of issues for many years. I have been involved in quite a few big negotiations. One big caveat before I begin is that anything I say here is really my personal opinion. I'm just going to be describing to you technical aspects of an agreement that we have, and then nothing of what I'm going to be saying can be attributed to the WTO Secretariat or to its members, right? So it's just the normal caveats you have for this type of presentations. Also, another caveat, this one is more practical, is in my job, I have to deal with the tariffs of all products. So I know a lot about tariffs, procedures, customs, etc., but do not expect that I know much about specific pharmaceutical products, etc. No? And then what I'm going to be telling you is about a specific agreement we have had in the WTO since almost 30 years ago. And this was the basis on which the tariffs on pharmaceutical products were being applied for a long time. This doesn't mean that this is necessarily what is going to be happening now onwards, because of all the reasons that Bob was telling you, in particular in the United States. So with all those caveats, let me just begin. So I'm just going to give you a bit of background, what type of products are currently covered by the Pharma agreement. I'll tell you a bit more about some of these reviews. This is an agreement that has been updated 4 times. And I would also like to give you some examples of how the domestic implementation, in particular in the European Union and the United States, looks and is very much based on this agreement that I'm going to be describing. This slide is a bit busy, but let me try to summarize it in very simple terms. We refer to it as the Pharma Agreement, but this is just a very informal name, and it's not really an international agreement as you would think in other contexts, right? So this is more a sort of arrangement. It's plurilateral. That means not all WTO members participate. It's only some of them. I'm going to be telling you later which ones. Well, in fact, you have it there below. Only 8 WTO members participate in this agreement, which is Canada, the EU, Japan, Macau, China, Norway, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, and the US. It's also what we call a sectoral liberalization agreement. So the idea is that members would typically try to fully liberalize, that means duty-free treatment for a certain sector. And the way they would typically do it is they will try to liberalize not only trade on the finished products, but also on all the intermediate substances and some of the inputs that you need to basically promote trade in that particular sector. No? So as I was telling you before, this agreement was originally concluded in 1994. And then since then, the idea was that every 3 years, you were going to have some form of review to include new substances, new inputs, new intermediate substances that are needed for the production of this type of products. In terms of what they were trying to achieve, I already told you it was supposed to be what we call them a 0 for 0 type of agreement. So the idea is any member that agrees to participate is going to fully liberalize all or eliminate all the tariffs, but also other duties and charges, which is a technical term we use in the WTO to refer to other type of, let's say, measures which are similar to tariffs from the point of view of only imports have to pay this type of taxes. And the idea is that they would be applied on most favored nation basis. In our context, I know Bob mentioned the MFN for purposes of the pricing, but then for us, in the context of the WTO, an MFN tariff means that is a tariff that you are going to be charging to all WTO members, right? So the 8 members that participate basically agreed that their tariff for products originating in any WTO member was going to be 0. So for example, you see China is not in there, India is not in there. So that means even if they are not participating, in principle, they should benefit from duty-free access into these markets. As we're going to see, that was precisely perhaps one of the reasons why the reviews stopped at some point. Once you have these agreements, there are sometimes concerns on what we call free riding, right? So basically you have some major markets that become very big producers of some of these products. And then basically they benefit from duty-free access in some markets, but then they themselves are not necessarily providing that duty-free access to others. Now, in the case of China, this is slightly different because when China was joining the WTO, they were required to basically eliminate tariffs on many of these products. So at least with respect to China, that's the case. But then, for example, for India, the right that they have to apply higher duties is much higher than the ones of the members that participate in this type of arrangement. Now, how do we achieve that duty-free MFN type of system? Well, the idea is in the WTO, we have these schedules of concessions. And then the idea is that these are legal instruments where for each WTO member, we set the maximum tariff that they commit to apply with respect to particular products. And then if there are disagreements as to whether this in this case, duty-free treatment is being provided, then we had a system of dispute settlement where another member can come and challenge that the duty-free, in this case, for example, duty-free treatment is not actually being provided, etc. One big challenge we have in the WTO is that our dispute settlement system has not been working properly since 2019. And one of the reasons for this is that we used to have a system of first instance and then appeals. We still have the first instance, but then we do not have the appeal system anymore. So it is possible sometimes that even if a member brings a dispute, they win. It is possible that the report is appealed and then there's no solution because there's no appeal body in place to look at this type of systems, right? So we have different problems in terms of how these rules are supposed to work in general, and then the Pharma agreement is not an exception to this, no? I am going to giving you these slides. You're going to see many of them. You have these links that you can just click and then get much more information on all these issues I have been mentioning in case you are interested. Now, in terms of the products, this agreement is quite peculiar because the way this normally works for most of the other, let's say, tariff negotiations we have, is that typically governments are going to come and negotiate based on harmonized system codes. I guess most of you are already familiar with the HS, is the way we call it. So this is numerical codes. It's a classification system administered by the World Customs Organization. This is the way that in any country in the world, you are going to be exporting something. The first thing that you need to know and determine together with the customs is what is the applicable HS code for this, right? So negotiating with based on HS codes is relatively straightforward. You know the HS code. Is the product covered by this code? If yes, then it's basically benefiting from the agreement, right? So in the case of the Pharma, there is a list of codes, yes, but then the problem was that this was considered not to be enough. There were sometimes differences in the way that some of the participants were classifying some of the products. I don't know if you're aware, but sometimes it happens that it's a legal framework that you need to interpret what is the right classification. And as in any legal system, sometimes you have different interpretations. So it might be that one substance is classified in the US in one place, and because of a different interpretation, is classified in the European Union in a different code, right? So to deal with this type of problem, they came out with a system where not only you have HS codes, but then they also used instruments which are actually used by industry to deal with this type of issues, right? So for example, sometimes there are chemical names that were used. You also have something which is called the Chemical Abstract Service, which is, I think, based in the US. And then they have this kind of like registry numbers. So substances have a registry number, and it's very, very detailed. You know exactly what that substance is. Then, because we're dealing with pharmaceutical products, there is a process in the World Health Organization that deals with the identification of what they call international non-proprietary names. So the idea is they identify pharmaceutical products, paracetamol, just to give you one example of an INN. And then the idea is that once you put a product in this INN list, basically there can be no commercial use of that particular name. So nobody can basically have an intellectual property right in the use of that particular name. And of course, this is important because you want to make sure that whoever is selling this type of products around the world, when the doctors see paracetamol, they are always talking about the same type of substance, right? These lists are discussed regularly in the World Health Organization, and I think they are updated once or twice per year. So what they did is they actually took all the list of INNs that have been approved up to a certain point, and then they included those in the agreement that they were defining as well, right? So it's quite unique from that point of view. To represent that, there were additional problems that has to do with the classification of some of these products, because you may have a specific substance, pharmaceutical substance, that then you can transport either in salts, esters, hydrates, right? So you can dilute it in water, you can dilute it in alcohol, you can dilute it in other types of transport type of system. And then the problem is, depending on that, the classification changed. Sometimes they were classified in the same subheading, which is a technical term we use when we are talking about these harmonized system codes. And sometimes they were classified somewhere else, right? So you had a lot of customs people who were very detailed involved in this type of discussions, identifying thousands and thousands of these substances. And then the question was, because of this disagreement, mainly between the US and the EU, they agreed, you know what, let's do something. Let's agree that if you can demonstrate that it's a substance of the type which is listed in this agreement, it doesn't matter where it's classified. We agree that we're going to be providing duty-free treatment to these substances. So this is, again, something very peculiar, because if you can demonstrate that your product is classified as one of the substances in any of these annexes covered by the Pharma, irrespective of the classification, you are supposed to be benefiting from duty-free treatment into this particular product. And then there were, finally, I told you, you had this intermediate type of substances. That's Annex 4. So the idea is that you can actually add those substances as well. I can tell you, I was involved in one of the reviews many years ago, and I was always shocked because they were having these discussions. And then, yes, you know, we have this substance, it's an intermediate substance. And the idea is you try to include those which are mostly used by the pharmaceutical industry. But sometimes they were saying, no, but the problem is this one is like 50% used for pharmaceutical products, but then it can also be used, I don't know, to produce rat poison or something else, right? Just because of the nature of this intermediate type of product, right? So depending on that, they would agree to fully liberalize or not. So again, just to emphasize on this point, on this particular point, so there are some of them. For example, HS Chapter 30 is fully covered. So if your product is classified in HS Chapter 30, in principle, the maximum duty that applies to that is 0. And same with some of these other codes that you have in there. Now, just a little caveat. These codes have changed over the years because the harmonized system changes also over the years. So these codes may not necessarily be exactly the ones that you have in here, and some of them may have been moving in or out of Chapter 30, etc. So it's not necessarily a straightforward issue because of the nature of how the HS changes. With respect to the other products that you have in Annex 1, this is the one on the INNs. So I was telling you this is the list defined by the World Health Organization. Then you have the substances in Annex 2 and Annex 3, again, that can be, they had a system of suffixes and prefixes, which is the way that chemically you use to denote whether they have been diluted into salt ester of hydrates, no? And then finally, the Annex 4. And then here they use the CAS codes, a mix of HS codes, sometimes product description, right? So it's a big mess, not a big mess, sorry, is the subconscious. A big arrangement of different instruments that they use to identify the specific substances. So the Pharma reviews, this is the list. Also, I'm giving you the link. You can click and you can actually see them. So you can see how many additional substances were being added. So you see first review took place in 1997. You had something like 465. The biggest one we had was the third review, which is the one in which I participated in March 2007. And then there was another one that took place in the year 2010. But even here, at some point, there was the question that was being raised, but wait a minute, you know, we are keep liberalizing substances on this, but the problem is some of the main producers of these substances are not participating and are not giving this type of treatment to us. So there is this free riding type of problem. There was another issue, which was that if you look at these documents, it did not really include the actual list of the products. They would say, we give the list to the WHO Secretariat, and we were not allowed to give this list to anybody. At some point in 2020, basically this changed. The members agreed that they were going to basically take all of the products that were listed in all these, in the original, plus the 4 reviews. So that means you have 5 different sources, and they would consolidate all the information in one single document. So that document we have here, which is Job MA 142, very, very important. If you want to have a full list of every product which is covered by the Pharma, that's exactly the one that you need to check to look at the different substances. It's hundreds and hundreds of different substances which are covered. This is just to give you an idea of how this looks. So for example, Annex 1 is the one that includes pharmaceutical active ingredients that bear an international non-proprietary name from the World Health Organization. So you have substances like theopronin, drobanibol, loxapine, etc. Look, I was telling you before, for me, these names means absolutely nothing, but I imagine for some of you, you know exactly what they are. They are also identified by a CAS number. And in this document, because the idea was to really identify the source, we know if it's coming from the original document or if it's coming from one of the reviews. And then you also have an indicative HS code where, in principle, that's where the substance may be classified, but for the reasons I was telling you before, is not necessarily the case, right? Because it might be that some members interpreted this differently. Then you have Annex 2. So this is basically some of these salt ester hydrates of pharmaceutical products, which are described, etc., with a combination of an INN active ingredient, and it has a prefix and a suffix. And again, I imagine that for the people who work on this makes a lot of sense. For me, very difficult to understand exactly what that means. And then you have, again, a list of the different product names, which is basically chemical type of formulations, right? If I can tell you a little story, there was once a problem because we were trying to deal with a legal instrument from Japan, and they realized it was in Excel, and for some reason Excel was not showing some of the characters. So the whole thing had to be scrapped at some point and redone just because of the Excel not showing some of the different characters. Now, sometimes you have double commas, double dashes, things like that, and all of these things have a meaning from a chemical point of view. Annex 3, again, this is the salt ester hydrates of INN active ingredients that are not classified in the same HS heading. So here you have, again, similar type of information of the INN, and then what's the name of the salt ester or hydrate. So for example, let me see if there's one I can actually read. Hexastrol, and then hexastrol dibutyrate, right? And then where to classify and what's the CAS number of that particular product. And you can see this one in particulars. Many of these are coming from the second review of the Pharma. The last one is this type of intermediate products I was telling you about that are also covered by the agreement. This is how the agreement actually reads. And then the idea is that each government, national customs authorities may require the importers to provide one or more of the following types of information. So again, this is quite peculiar because it adds, if you want to benefit from the duty-free treatment, you of course have to provide this additional information in the context of this classification procedure that take place once you're in customs, once you're trying to import the different products. I imagine we have some people in the meeting who have actually worked and deal with this. So perhaps if you can tell us afterwards how this works in practice, I would be very interested to know. But in principle, that's what they were supposed to be doing. Now, again, another caveat. If you are importing something in places like Switzerland, it turns out that Switzerland, all the tariffs, they eliminated about 1 year ago. So if tariffs are zero on absolutely everything, then none of this is really needed because everything is duty-free anyway, right? So there's no need to have additional identification of anything if basically all the products are on a duty-free basis, no? I also wanted to show you from the national implementation point of view. So in the European Union, you have implementing regulation that sets what we call the combined nomenclature. So basically, this is the place where you can actually see what is the nomenclature, what are the tariffs that are going to be applicable. And here there is one paragraph 6 that talks about the whole issue of pharmaceutical substances. So there's something very specific here about pharmaceutical substances. There is also one section that talks about pharmaceutical products. And then there is one section that makes reference to annexes. What type of annexes? Well, probably after what I just explained, you are not going to be surprised. So it's the list of the INNs, the list of the prefixes, suffixes with the salts, ester, and hydrates that can be classified in the same place, the ones that are classified differently, and then all the other products, right? So you see, for example, Annex 6, the way they call it is list of pharmaceutical intermediates, which are compounds used for the manufacture of finished pharmaceutical products, which are duty-free. In the case of the US, you have the harmonized tariff schedule. And then again, they have one note, in this case is note 13, which is the one that provides this duty-free treatment. And the way they do it is different a bit from the way of the European Union. And the idea is they have a letter in the tariff book. If you have that, then you know you have to go to these annexes, etc. And then you look at the annexes, it's exactly the same I was showing you before, right? So it's the ones where you have the INNs, the ones with the salts, ester, hydrates, etc. Right? So if you work on this and ever wonder where all this system coming from, well, it's actually something that came from that negotiation that took place almost 30 years ago in 1995. No? This is the conclusion of the explanation of the Pharma agreement. If you have questions, I will do my best to try to explain. I just wanted to give you some additional tools that may be useful for you. Bob was talking about all the uncertainty that you are facing, big changes taking place in different things. Your job is to try to get some form of competitive advantage or competitive edge over your competitors. And then it's interesting that some of the work that we do here at the WTO may actually give you some of that advantage, right? If I can mention just two of them, one of them is, and I put it in red, which is the e-ping. So every time a country is going to be implementing a technical regulation, in terms of how the substances have to be made, etc. In principle, they have to provide a draft which has to be analyzed by the stakeholders and also by the other members. So we have this e-ping system where the members, and I think the major markets are very, very good in terms of providing this draft technical regulations. For example, if there's going to be some technical regulation on medicines, which is new or whatever thing, in principle, this is considered to be a technical barrier to trade. So it's normally included in the e-ping system, so you can be alerted that some of these new draft technical regulations are coming, and then you even gain the right, depending on the market, to provide comments and then have some influence, or at least have your say in terms of how these draft technical regulations are going to be applied. And I imagine for some of you, you do this already for the US and for the EU, but the interesting thing about this platform is basically for 164 members around the world, you get this type of information. So it's a big advantage if you can actually use it effectively, right? And then the other one I was going to be mentioning, and I didn't really put it here, but has to do with trade facilitation. So with everything which is happening, tariff levels changing, etc., the customs procedures become very, very important. There are many different tools which are available precisely to facilitate and to deal with this type of situations. If you have been operating in a system where you were paying 0 tariffs, probably you were not paying too much attention to this. But if the situation changes, then knowing what those tools are become incredibly important, right? So the trade facilitation type of discussions is also one of those that we do here at the WTO, and I imagine would be quite important for you as well in terms of the new conditions of trade. I stop here, Bob, in case.
Thanks, Roy. Just on that last point, Roy, would that be the trade concerns database that people would follow, or are they following some of the other one of the other links? Is that the trade monitoring database?
To be very honest, I didn't put it here. I forgot. But then if you go to the first one, which is called WTO database catalog,
yeah,
in there you have access to all the different databases, including things like anti-dumping, countervailing duties, subsidies, and then you just look for trade facilitation. I'm going to put the name, and I'll put the link in the chat as well, so it's easier for you to find.
That'd be super helpful. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time, Roy, and great to hear the explanation of the agreement. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody, and I'm going to call this to a close. Thank you very much.